All right, hello, welcome everybody. I am here with my friend Tripp Parker. Tripp and I have had multiple conversations, kind of both on my channel and Randos United. We have a similar background-ish, kind of both work in sort of data sciencey, machine learning, technology stuff. You have much more of a more formal philosophical education than I do. But do you want to say anything about yourself, Tripp?
Sure. I've, I guess we met essentially through like this randos like Discord, right? That Paul Vanderklay put on. And so that's how we started to interact. But really that all came out of like the interest in Jordan Peterson, right? And what he was doing, because that's how I found Paul Vanderklay. I'm sure that's how you found Paul Vanderklay. It was his commentaries on Jordan Peterson. I've always found that to be like a very fascinating. And so we kind of like, formed a little community and we started interacting and those kind of things. Yeah, I do have, one of the things that I find the most interesting about Peterson is when I think he's a astute observer of human nature, but then also he has some very interesting philosophical positions that I think are really interesting, which is also my background. My master's is in philosophy of mind, but I work in the tech industry doing like artificial intelligence and machine learning type stuff as well. So that's my background and why I'm interested in this.
Yeah, and so we're going to do a commentary on a conversation that Jordan Peterson had with Jonathan Pageau and Douglas Murray. That came out, was it, I think, yesterday? Yeah, it came out yesterday.
Yeah, it came out yesterday.
And so hopefully we'll be hot off the presses with this commentary. But I thought it was very interesting. Douglas Murray is sort of like, he's like a lapsed Anglican Christian. He's well known for kind of writing sort of conservative books and columns, especially in the UK. He's much more famous in the UK than I think he is in the US. But he's sort of like I wish I could be a Christian, but I've got problems. He's also gay, right? And married to a guy.
He is gay and he's married. Yeah, I think he's the editor-in-chief of Spectator in the UK as well, and he's written like several books. More like a kind of a conservative cultural commentator, but he's like, you can see in this talk the dissonance that he lives with as being like kind of like Christian atheist, conservative, gay, married, like all of this comes out in what he's talking about here. And so he's like, I want to believe, but I can't believe. And so that's why I always find Douglas to be like a very fascinating person to bring into these conversations, and why I think that like actually, he's a really good conversation partner for Peterson.
Mm-hmm. And he's also, he's sort of a defender of traditionalism, but yet he, in many ways, isn't very traditional. And I bet he has a very cosmopolitan life and a very cosmopolitan social group, right, and all of those sorts of things.
There's just like he is large. He contains multitudes, right? He has like very contradictory things that he's trying to hold all in his head at the same time, which is why he's so fascinating to me as well, and why I like whenever I saw Pageau, Murray, Peterson, I'm definitely watching this one. I've been not listening to a lot of the Peterson stuff more recently because they've become overtly political, which is not even that I necessarily disagree with a lot of the things being said. It's just not as interesting to me. Yeah. But bringing Murray in and Pageau with Peterson, and then they get going on the religion thing. And I think this is why this talk, in my mind, is the best thing that Peterson has done in years. And the reason is, it echoes back to, and you can tell, I think they even talk about it in the talk, that like they're starting the Exodus lectures, right? Yeah, and so like the thing that drew me to Peterson originally was his Bible series lectures that I just thought were absolutely fascinating. And so like the fact that this was an overtly kind of Christian atheist whatever you want to call Peterson, and then Orthodox Christian with Pageau was just like a very fascinating. And this is where Peterson's at his best, right? Is wrestling with these things. And I thought this was really good. And is Peterson also at his best lately too, because he's becoming a better conversation partner and letting other people talk. And not just like dominating or just going back to play the hits and those kind of things, and actually having a conversation. So like, I thought this was like the best thing that I've seen him do in years. And so that's why when I saw it, I was like pinging you. I was like, hey, we got to talk about this, because like this was really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah, and I also think that part of what aids this conversation is that they all, or at least Peterson knows both of them very well. I'm not sure how well Douglas and Jonathan, how much they've ever interacted.
I think this is the first time that they've talked. I think this is the first time that Murray and Pageau have ever spoken. So I think they actually introduced. Yeah, I mean, at least publicly. I think that Murray even like says it's a pleasure to meet you in the video to Jonathan. So I'm not sure that they've ever spoken at all.
Right.
So yeah.
But Jordan knows each of them very well. So
he knows each of them really well, and it is also another thing is like the combination of the three of them was really interesting, because like you'll see that like Douglas is very, very precise, right, in what he's asking and the problems that he has and those kind of things and the worries and those kind of, and then you have like Peterson's trying to like play off this, this different kind of metaphorical truth and that kind of thing, and then you have Pageau, who at points is very precise, but then at points is also like he's an artist, right? And so like he's like very squishy on some things, but then he will get very precise, and you can see that he has a very, very good point at some of these places, which was interesting, because I think that in some ways Jonathan was trying to he actually was pinpointing the answer that Douglas needed. I don't know that he was like super effective at communicating it, but I think that you you could tell that like he knew what needed to be said. And I just think that like he's not a debater or anything else like that. He's an icon carver. I actually have some of his icons. I love Jonathan. But it was a really fascinating, like, I think, interplay between all three of them.
It's also interesting because Jonathan Pageau he grew up fundamentalist, right? Like
I think so, yeah.
I remember, I've only seen him in person one time, but he was in Chicago giving a talk, and he said that it was good to be back in Chicago, and that he had spent some amount of time growing up in Chicago because his dad got a PhD at Wheaton. And I was like, wait, what?
Oh, I didn't know his dad went to Wheaton.
Right?
That's interesting.
And so Jonathan gets sort of modernist evangelical sensibilities. And in a certain sense, Douglas is kind of embodying that. Like, did Jesus actually get out of the grave? Right? Like, guys, that's the question that I'm really actually asking. Like,
right.
Jordan, I appreciate your metaphorical, psychological meanderings, but like at the end of the day, did Jesus get out of the grave? And Jonathan's like, okay, what you're asking is, did Jesus get out of the grave? And like,
yeah. Let me repeat back to you the obvious question that you just asked me, right? Yeah.
Right.
And that's true, and that's why in some ways, like Murray, I would say this about like Sam Harris too. Sam Harris is far more of a fundamentalist than most Christians, I would say. And I think that Murray has some of that going on as well, where like, no, I need the propositions before I can,
If I'm really going to do this Christian thing, I'm going to do it the way that I think is right. And that there's this standard of what it would mean to believe these things in the creed that Murray respects and takes seriously. And that it's precisely his respect for what it would mean for him to affirm that prevents him from affirming that.
Right. And he also expresses, like, I don't know that I linked to this particular point, but like he echoes back, Tom Holland's admonition that Christians embrace the weird, right? Like, don't back off of these claims. Like, if that's what you mean, like, say that you mean that. Don't try and obfuscate or be embarrassed about it or anything else like that. Like, embrace it. If Jesus got out of that grave, say he got out of that grave, like he walked around and got out. Don't like give me this like metaphorical resurrection and just like squish around it. Douglas is not interested in that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess maybe with that sort of introduction, let's see if we can play an actual clip here. All right.
Welcome, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce the both of you. And Douglas, maybe I'll get you to open. I remembered, and I was struck by the comments that you made, I believe, when you were talking to Dave Rubin about the transformation of your thoughts in relationship to religious conceptualization and your insistence or your realization or your speculation that something like a fictional metaphysic or is a necessary precondition for the stabilization of more rational worldviews, including conservative, liberal, and perhaps scientific. And so hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth. I hope I derived the right gist and conclusion from your comments. And so I'd be happy to hear what you have to say about all that.
First of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you both, and particularly to meet Jonathan for the first time. I don't know if there's been a shift in the last few years in my thinking, but certainly in the last 15 years or so, no doubt about that. I was brought up a Christian, and indeed in adulthood was a believing Christian into my late 20s. As is, I think, sometimes quite common, I fell into atheism, being a non-believer in my, I suppose, late 20s. And there are lots of reasons for that we could get into. But I was very much sort of part of that, a minor part of that new atheism movement in the 2000s. And I suppose I had a period in which I thought that was enough. And through the years that followed that, I suppose I had some of the zeal of the convert, as it were, that can happen with atheists as much as it can happen with the religious. With the zeal of the convert, once that sort of fell away a bit, I was left with the same questions that I was before, with perhaps a less dogmatic tone. And I suppose one of the things that was on my mind increasingly in the 2010s was that question of what's often been, many people are credited with the thought that the German jurist Bochenförder, Ernst Wolfgang Bochenförder, is usually regarded as having done it most epigrammatically, which is to pose the question, can a society continue to survive in its form if it has cut itself off from the things that gave it birth? In other words, if you like Western societies, if you like societies like Britain, America, and elsewhere, there are several directions you can go in. One is to pretend that these societies owe nothing to Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is something that is attempted as a claim by some people. I think it's risible. But once you accept that the Christian tradition at least gave a very significant amount, at least was an incredibly important strand of our societies, and that what we treasure and cherish in our societies today, we would not treasure or cherish if we didn't have that inheritance. Once you accept that, then there's this question of, is that society you have able to sustain itself? Are the things you love able to sustain themselves and be replenished without reference to the thing that gave them birth? Put it another way, let's say we're sitting on a branch. Does the branch remain up if the roots of the tree are not nurtured? And that, putting it that way, of course, makes the answer rather obvious, which is, well, obviously not. I mean, if you use the branch of the tree analogy, obviously that doesn't work. That's like sawing off the branch you're sitting on. But then that poses a further question, and I addressed this a bit in the book you referred to there, Jordan, Strange Death of Europe. There are a number of chapters I use in that book, which is about movement of peoples in the 21st century, the ease of movement, migration, and many other difficult questions. But the part of the book which, at least I think is most significant, if I say so myself, is the portion on what I describe as a state of Western man's belief in the 21st century. That history has happened, discoveries have happened, biblical criticism has happened, Darwin has happened, science has happened, discoveries have happened, the the way in which we used to explain things we didn't know by putting God in there has increasingly been narrowed, so that increasingly we know through science and discoveries how certain things in our universe happen, how certain things in our bodies happen, and the role of God diminished and diminished. But that, as I explained it in Strange Death of Europe, that we are in this, and I myself am in this uncomfortable position, because, of course, if you believe that what you, and recognize that what you love and want to sustain is a very significant part from this particular route, what do? Various theologians, albeit perhaps heretical theologians, like Don Cupid and Richard Holloway, have also asked this question. But it's a difficult and, I admit, frustrating position to be in, the one that I hold, because in part, and I think, Jordan, you yourself have experienced this, in part it's frustrating because Christians say, well, therefore, why don't you just believe? And that's not as straightforward as those Christians seem to think. They seem to think, well, we've got you in a corner by you recognizing what you owe to the religion. So therefore, make the final leap.
Big government.
Yeah. So I guess the reason I wanted to set that up is because I think it very well summarizes like Douglas's issues, right? Is that he's worried that, without Christianity, we're losing something that's very meaningful, without like a broader cultural belief or even like a personal belief. We're losing something super meaningful. But then also, he's frustrated because they're like, it's kind of like, I mean, Jordan Peterson has said this in the past, like when he doesn't like when people ask him if he believes in God. And so like, Douglas is saying like, I don't want to be asked that question. Do I, and I don't want to be like, well, since this is important, therefore believe. He's saying, well, I think that science has shown us that this is not true, at least like factually or literally or whatever you want to say it. Like that's not true. Science has eliminated this from the realm of possibility of belief. And yet I worry about what happens whenever that belief goes away. And that's where Douglas is. I don't know if you have thoughts about that, but I will say, I don't know that that's actually Douglas's problem. I think that's one of the problems. But I think that I don't think if I could give him an intellectual, defense, like a rational defense of, say, the evidence for the resurrection, which I think that Christians have been doing for a very long time. I don't actually think that is like the ultimate problem with Douglas. I don't think that will be sufficient, but I do think it's necessary. And so I just didn't know what do you take from his framing?
Yeah, I do wonder how much. I mean, I think he's describing something at the society level that is very true, right? And there is sort of a lack of faith at the macro level that seems to be happening more and more, and even seems to, I don't know, in my at least estimation, have accelerated a fair amount recently. But there's always the question of why do individual people believe what they believe? What would it take for them to change their mind? Like, I think when Bethel talked to him, right, Douglas said, I would need to hear a voice or something like that. And I think that was probably closer to the truth than if Bethel's parents gave him, some super rigorous maximal case for the resurrection
right.
Presentation with, 27 and a half bullet points.
Right.
And so, but
I guess my question is, do you think that even if he did hear a voice?
I think it would depend on what it felt like to hear that voice.
Yeah.
I think that
you're more charismatic than I am, so maybe you think this is like you've thought about this question before.
I am more charismatic than you are, and I would, I feel like I've had some of those sorts of voicey kind of moments, but you can always doubt them. That you're perfectly right about that. It's just that sometimes those things, whatever your interior barometer of how real an experience is, right? Like we have that sort of thing inside us that tells us how real what we're experiencing is. It's just like in some of those experiences, it's like the barometer goes above the normal level, not below, right? And it's sort of like, when dreams, sometimes you wake up from a dream and you pretty quickly realize, oh yeah, it was just a dream. And you almost even had a sense while you were dreaming, right, that it didn't feel very real. But sometimes you have a dream that's like so real, it like takes you hours to like shake off some of the things from your dream, right?
I had a dream that I like wrecked my car, and I spent most of the next day like thinking, how am I going to get my car fixed?
Right.
Like I literally could not, and it wasn't until later I was like, oh wait, I didn't actually wreck my car. Like I didn't like, that's not a thing. So yeah, I totally agree. Like sometimes you like wake up and you're like, was that real? Was it not? And sometimes in a dream though, I know that this is a dream. Yeah.
Yeah. Or you're still mad at the person that you were mad at in your dream. Right. You're still holding a grudge against them. Yeah. And so I think he would need some sort of experience that like kicked his real meter up a level that it just hadn't ever been at before regarding some sort of spiritual experience.
I wonder whether or not also, because I mean we'll get into this, but like, because he takes these like, because he takes like kind of the totality of the demand of Christianity very seriously. Like it's something that like came across, like he doesn't want to halfway this kind of thing, right? Because of like the fact that he is a gay man, I don't think that he's going to, that's one of the things that I wonder whether or not that's also a barrier. And so like no amount of, so like he's going to have to like wrestle with that, I feel like, alongside, because otherwise it's always going to be more appealing to explain away the maximal data evidence for the resurrection. It's always going to be, this vision wasn't really a vision, it was just like a hallucination or something like that. That's always going to be an option because like there's this other area of his life that he doesn't want to surrender. And so that's always been my interest with Douglas Murray is and so like that's another thing that I wonder about with him is like whether or not like that, well, not whether, it's to what extent that's playing a role, because it does for all of us, right? We all have areas that like it's hard to surrender, and like this one is, he's married to a guy, and I don't get the sense that Douglas is going to accept that, like, oh, if Jesus is God, or I know you don't think that, but like, but like, if the Christian claims are true, then this other thing is not acceptable, right? I don't think that he's going to allow for some kind of middle way there, like mentally.
Because I think any version of Christianity that doesn't uphold the traditional sexual ethic, he would find too watered down and compromised to respect. And any form of Christianity that he would respect would hold to its traditional stance on marriage and sexuality. And so in order to convert, it would have to be to a thing that he respected. And the thing that he respected would force him to make a fundamental change in many areas of his life if he were to embrace it. So I guess with that, should we go into the next clip? I mean, sure. I guess another thing that is interesting, I mean, he does think that Christianity is the sort of thing that can, like, motivate and empower an entire civilization for eons, right? Right. It's not just a couple propositions here and there. And he acknowledges its potential and its historical effect on the world, right? And particularly England and Western civilization, or whatever you want to call it. So, it's not like some atheists that think that the effect on your actions is so disconnected from the effects of your belief or something like that.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it's fascinating. And I think that, I think you're actually right when he says, like, he wouldn't respect, like, a Christianity without, like, an insistence on the sexual ethic. I think that that kind of same, like, intellectual, like, that same kind of respect he's going to need for the claim that the resurrection actually literally happened, right?
Mhm.
And so like he's like, I know, like it's all or nothing, right, for him.
Yeah.
And so like that's, I think it's more than just the case for the resurrection for him. It's something. It's like it's holistic. Like he's got that kind of those kind of questions, which is going to be interesting, you know, in talking to, you know, Peterson and Pageau, because they want to like kind of emphasize like the mythological truth and the pragmatic truth and those kind of things. But he's like, no, I appreciate all that. I admit the mythological and the pragmatic truth. Did it literally happen though? Like that's what I want to know. Like, did it really happen?
And I think what Peterson and Pageau are kind of doing is they're trying to kind of get underneath that distinction, right? And trying to say, well, like, if you believe that part, you're already basically believing the whole thing, right?
Yeah,
and, like,
right.
all we need to do is, like, kind of resort your metaphysics a little bit to have you put that metaphorical truth higher than the literal truth, and then, like, it'll connect back down. Whereas, like, he has this literal truth higher than metaphorical truth, so it's like there's a wall, right? And I think they're trying to do that rearranging, but at the same time, they aren't quite taking the thrust of his point as seriously as he wants them to.
Right. Well, because I mean, this is he can always like this is the I question that strategy, I guess, in terms of like actually engaging in this conversation, because, you know, like Brett Weinstein talks about, you know, metaphorical truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some things that can pragmatically work but are literally false, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, Brett uses the example of like the porcupine, the belief that the porcupine can throw its spines at you is pragmatically useful, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it can be literally false. And so,
or treating every gun as if it's loaded, right?
Treating every gun as if it's loaded, exactly. It can be like pragmatically a very useful thing that can last generations, right? This belief, but be literally false. And Douglas is saying, okay, I hear you. I get you, it's pragmatic. I'm not even going to debate that. This isn't like Dawkins, who thinks it's like a parasite or something that we can just do away with or anything else like that. That's not Murray's problem at all. So with someone like Murray, I think with someone like Dawkins, you can undermine his kind of atheistic claims by doing that. But with someone like Murray, he's like, no, I'm granting you all of that. All of the pragmatism, give me all the mythology, all the story, all the myth, all that, all good.
All the civilizational rejuvenizing, yeah.
He's like, this is all great for everyone, and I love it. And is it true? Like, did it actually happen? Right? And so that's where, like, I question with him that strategy. I think with someone like Dawkins, you can actually undermine the entire like new atheist movement by pointing these things out. But I think with someone like Douglas, you're going to have to do something a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah.
But do you want to get into like the science and the causation stuff a little bit?
Yeah, I think that like, so that, you know, Pageau talks about the unity of a glass for a little bit, and I'm not sure if that's like what we want. So like, do science and religion overlap? I think sort of, right?
Yeah.
And sort of that, that's, all right, I've got a timestamp for that. All right, 1 second.
I can't hear it right now, by the way. I'm not sure what happened.
I can fix that. Sorry. There was a button I didn't click. All right. Thanks for pointing that out. All right. I think that this is more or less the right place.
And so then as a scientist, what you try to do is you try to pit your theory up against the transcendent reality so that it fails, so that you find something about what you don't understand that is able to make itself manifest. Then you adjust the theory to get a better grip on the world. And you assume while you're doing that there's an underlying logic to the transcendent object, and that analysis of that underlying object is both corrective and redemptive. And as far as I can tell, those are all essentially axiomatic religious claims, and that they're preconditions for any true empirical science. And then, so what that implies is that if we lose faith in the transcendent hierarchy, we might lose the entire scientific endeavor.
Let me just briefly, if I may, take us away from the glass of water, because I only have Jonathan Pageau's word that it is a glass of water, and I don't want to get into that. Let me address what I think is a sort of a necessary thing to begin with, which is the issue of the magisteria. We are talking about them separately, but of course the interrelation of them. Whether or not the realms of science and religion are overlapping magisteria or not. And of course, some people would claim that they're absolutely unrelated. We're getting towards, I think, in this discussion, the realization that of course they're overlapping to some degree. We don't know exactly how much. Jonathan probably thinks very significantly. I suspect Jordan thinks to some extent, and I would say to some extent as well. But let me throw out then two issues that I would put as a challenge both for the religious and the non-religious in the discussion that we're heading towards. The first is the challenge for the non-religious, and that's to do with something that Jordan's already talked about, which is the area of ethics and shared values and much more. A great challenge for the non-believers in our age is that issue of where the values come from. And as Jordan's already suggested, for instance, the Enlightenment, the idea of rationalism, sole rationalism, which not all Enlightenment thinkers were dealing with, but many were. The idea of rationalism being the sole way in which to discern ethics seems to me not to have been embedded very wide or very deep, and may suggest that it's just not possible as a project. So, to quote my late friend Rabbi Jonathan Sachs on this, the idea that ethics are self-evident is self-evidently wrong. So let me throw that out first as a challenge for the non-believer. Then the challenge for the believer comes down to this thing that Jordan's also already dealt in, which is the issue of, let's say, myth or story. Because we might agree, for instance, that we need a story to agree upon, or a myth to agree upon, or a set of ideas to rely upon and to ground ourselves in. And that doesn't necessarily, of course, by any means lead to the fact that those things are also true. We get into the realm of what Schopenhauer in the dialogue on religion, which always made a huge impression on me, deals in, where he says, of course, what he describes as the tragedy of the clergy. The tragedy of the clergy is that they know the necessity of the thing, they know the truthfulness of the story, in a certain sense of truthfulness, but could never admit, or their job would be over, that that's what it is. In other words, they have to continue.
Right, I think that might be a good place to pause for now. I'm not sure if that was exactly the section that we were going for, but it's an interesting section. So that last thing that Douglas says, like the preacher's dilemma is outlined by Schopenhauer, right? Like basically the preachers, the well-educated clergy know that this whole thing is baloney, right? At the literal level, perhaps. But yet it has this metaphorical oomph to it. And so they're in charge of continuing to propagate the thing that they interpret as literal baloney, but figurative usefulness. And so I had a conversation on my channel with a guy named David Sloan Wilson, who's a evolutionary biologist, and he's like all about group level selection. And he has talked more than almost anyone else, I think, about sort of how to understand religion from a evolutionary standpoint. But even when I was talking to him, he asked me basically the same version of this question. Like, well, how does it feel like you still consider yourself religious? How do you do that if you know that it's all just a human-made thing, right? Like, he thought that his evolutionary explanation of religion explains it away, basically, right? By explaining it through some sort of scientific lens, therefore it's deconstructed, right? And so there's this difference between preacher talk and, like, everyday, you know, like, oh, don't listen to the preacher talk, just listen to, you know, like, just do the ethical ramifications of it. And there's this weird dichotomy between the myth and what it causes you to do, and what it causes you to do is important.
Yeah. So to me, that sounds. I mean, yeah, I did watch that video with you, and I was glad that you got Wilson on, because I find him really interesting. I think that to me that sounds like a version, like his assumption, therefore, that since, you know, I can explain religion somehow evolutionarily, it's therefore like deconstructed or whatever. It sounds to me like that's an informal logical fallacy. I think that, like, that, I mean, you know, that's what C.S. Lewis described as bulverism. Mm-hmm. That just because I can describe the source of something by some kind of like historical or biological or whatever, that therefore you have no reason to believe that that's actually true. And so, right. You know, an example would be like, okay, if I made the claim, hey, it's a bad idea to let your cat defecate around your house, especially if you have a pregnant wife. Like I would say that, and you'd be like, well, you just think that because your doctor told you that, or your parents brought you up that way.
Or it's a folk superstition.
Or whatever. And that's the only reason you believe that. And actually, I can prove that this is the date that you were told that information, and you've never tested, blah, blah, blah. So, like, I can give you a whole story on why it is that you think that. Nonetheless, that does not undermine in any way whether or not it's actually true. And so, like, that kind of explanation of, well, the you know, you only believe this because you happen to be born in this area of the world and those kind of things, it has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not it's true. I believe that 3 times 0 equals 0. I think I am you know, I'm very well positioned to have that belief. Now, there was a time where we didn't even have a concept of 0 in mathematics, and that was actually like kind of a conceit. And so if you had asked me if I had been born, say, 20,000 years ago, and you had asked me what 3 times 0 is, I would have no idea what you're talking about. And as you can say, well, the only reason that you believe 3 times 0 is 0 is because you were actually born at a time where you had a concept of 0, and then you were taught multiplication and all these things, and now you have this this belief that 3 times 0 is 0. Yeah, fair enough. If I was born 20,000 years ago and you asked me what 3 times 0 is, I would have no idea I wouldn't even be able to answer the question, right? In some sense. At the same time, that does not mean I am wrong. And when I say 3 times 0 is 0, and it does not mean I'm not well founded in saying it as such. And so, like that, like what Wilson is saying is, well, I've given you an evolutionary description of how we got to this belief and why it's useful and all those kind of things. And so, doesn't it bother you that it's not true? And you're like, this is a non sequitur. This does not follow that it's not true at all. Right. In fact, I would argue. In some sense, like it might actually support my argument that it is true. Right. That the reason that we gravitate toward these kind of stories and that they work is that they are true. And so, you know, we can all talk about, like, you know, those kind of things, but like I just reject that. That to me seems like an informal logical fallacy of the first degree. Like,
or it's perhaps related to, and now we can get sort of into Aristotelianism and causation and stuff like that. It's the elevation of the efficient cause over and against any other form of cause, right?
Correct. So do you want to, like, do you want to talk about, like, the 4 types of causation in Aristotelian? You know, and just like describe to people who haven't heard, because I imagine a lot of people have not actually thought about causation, and certainly not Aristotelian, you know, description of it.
Right. All right. So we've got 4 times, and I feel a little bit like you should do this, but I'll do it anyway. All right. I feel so there are 4 kinds of causation, right? There's material causation, which is like, what stuff is it made out of? Here, I'll be super obnoxious. So I'm going muskie fishing this weekend, right?
Oh, nice.
Yeah, with my dad. And so I have this new muskie lure that I was opening. So for people not listening, I'm holding this giant, ugly, weird-looking fishing lure. All right, so what's the material causation? Well, it's made out of this soft plastic stuff, and there's some metal hooks running through it, right? Okay, so the material cause of this lure is the plastic and the other stuff that it's made out of. And that's a sort of causation that, although we don't tend to think of that as causation, really. It's just sort of like descriptive. But anyway, I'll leave that aside. All right, the efficient cause. The efficient cause is sort of what forces brought something into being, right? And so this was made at some fishing lure factory. And musky fishing lures are produced in low volume, so it's probably some guy in his workshop, right? So there's probably some guy in his workshop in northern Wisconsin who ordered these parts from China and glued them together up in northern Wisconsin. All right, so that is how this thing came to exist, and then it was mailed to me, right? Okay. And then there is the formal causation, which is like, what form is this? So this is the form of a weird fishing lure, right? It kind of looks like a perch. That's sort of the intention, but it's not exactly a perch, right? And then so the form is like, what shape is it, right? Basically, but also sort of in an even deeper philosophical sense, like, you know, what ideal shape is it trying to be conformed to, right? Conformed, right, means to share form. So there's some form in the heavens, right? That's the perfect version, right? And this thing is
what universal is this instantiating, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so this is, you know, a Medusa musky fishing lure, you know.
Right.
But in a certain sense, it's weird. Fishing lures are weird because they're imitating a form, right?
That's true.
Imitating the form of a fish that a muskie would eat, right?
That's true.
But to me, a human can easily distinguish between the two, but the fish can't. All right. And then there is the teleological cause, or the purpose cause, or the final cause. Right? Like, what is it for? And this is for me to be able to catch muskies, right?
Yeah.
And so those are the 4 different kinds of causation. And for Aristotle, he would have said all 4 causes are always at work, basically, in everything, right? And it's important to be able to distinguish them. But what's weird is sort of after the scientific revolution, we really came to prioritize material cause and efficient cause, right?
Right.
Like, what is stuff? And it's like matter and energy, basically, right? There's the stuff that it's made of, and then there's the energy processes that cause things to happen the way they happen, right? We came to sort of doubt forms, right? Kind of through nominalism, right? You know, forms are just names that we give to stuff, right? We call this a fishing lure, but really that's just a human convention of what we call it, right? There's no fishing lure in the heavens. And, you know, telos, obviously even worse, you know, evolution is random. The universe is just, you know, physical laws, perhaps with indeterminacy thrown in at the quantum level, and stuff just moves around.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I would actually say that we still do use all these forms of causation, even in our language, even though, like, in a philosophical discussion, or like even like a, you know, kind of a religious debate, we would resist using them that way. But we do in our everyday lives, which is why I don't think actually calling things material causation is actually. I don't actually think that is, we don't use it that way. I would say, like, you know, say you saw a giant ball of lightning, or like, you know, fire or something in the sky. You would say, like, what caused that? And really, like, you're asking, like, what is it, right? And like, what is it made of? And so you would ask that question, and I said, actually, that's like I would give you some like explanation about like the electrons or something like that. You'd be like, that's what that light was that you saw in the sky. It wasn't an alien. It was like, you know, some kind of static electricity that like built up, and, you know, whatever. And you say, okay, well, but again, like what caused that? And you would say, well, you know, what caused it was, you know, again, we would talk about, movement of electrons in storm systems and various things like that. And so I would talk about like efficient causation as well as material causation in that, right? And so like we would talk about both of those things. with that kind of thing, like, okay, but now we're talking about, now you're getting a picture of like the form of the thing that it is, right? What is this kind of thing? And it comes into like a unitary picture of, because you saw a ball of light. You distinguished that ball of light from the clouds around it. So you had a picture of the form of the thing that we're talking about. So you unified it into one particular picture. And with this one, like a teleological cause, we'd probably have to go to some like kind of divine explanation, because otherwise, there's no like agency involved. But with other things, and this is one of the things that like frustrated me about like the Vervaeke lectures is, early on, whenever he was going over the Greek philosophy, was he kind of assumed that like, okay, once, we talked about the teleology of the planetary movements. Right. And so like, that was the way that like Aristotle talked about, planets moving around and that kind of stuff. He talked about telos, that they like, this was what their end was for, like what they were trying to do as entities. And the issue is that, and so what he was arguing was that because we could mathematically describe what they were doing, and then we like came up with a theory of like gravitational, all that kind of stuff, gravitational movement and that kind of thing, then therefore we got rid of teleology in the world. And so there is no teleological cause in the universe, but that is simply a non sequitur. Just because we can describe something mathematically and slap a name on it, like the theory of gravity or whatever else, does not actually mean that there's no telos, there's no teleological cause for the thing. And by the way, we still do that. If I ask, like, if I go into my kid's room and it's a mess, I'd be like, what happened here? And what I don't want from them is some kind of like material or efficient cause. Well, you see, Dad, these atoms hit these other atoms, and then like eventually, like, they all end up like this. And sorry, I'd be like, no. Why is your stuff everywhere? What were you trying to do? What was the telos that you were trying? And we're like, oh, we were trying to build a fort. That's what we were trying to do, and that's how we ended up here. And by the way, we use this in biology too. What is your heart for? What is your liver for? What is your nose for? Right?
Yeah.
And so, so we use still teleological causes all the time, and even that we just have messed up the nomenclature a little bit, but we still use it that way. And that's why Aristotle like intuitively said, okay, these are all types of causation, but notice none of them are exclusive. There's not formal cause without material cause, without efficient cause, without teleological cause. And so you're not going to get a situation where, these all exist simultaneously. So like, yes, there's a material cause for all the crap on my kid's floor. There's an efficient cause for all the crap on my kid's floor. There's a formal cause for all the crap on my kid's floor. And there's a teleological cause for all the crap on my kid's floor. These all exist simultaneously. They are not exclusive. And in fact, they all have to exist simultaneously. Otherwise, we have chaos, right? Yeah. Otherwise, we don't have an explanation at all. And if you don't, and this is one of the things. So like I was telling you before, my thesis that I wrote was on a neo-Aristotelian view of mental causation in college, and basically this was my argument, that I was arguing for a a dualist view of the mind-body problem. That I don't think that a materialistic view at all actually suffices as an explanatory power. And so my argument was, listen, we have all this other information about what's going on. So we have intention. Intention is not a scientific category. It doesn't exist in nature. I can't there's where your intention was, right? It's not a material thing at all. And yet we know that you have intention whenever you do something. And so my argument was basically, because we have this information about what you're doing, and this purely material, efficient causal model that cannot adequately explain that information or account for it or even make sense of why it's there at all, Therefore, it's an inadequate model, and we need a different one. And so, therefore, I think the Aristotelian model works because it does include these other kind of agency, teleology, formal causes, that kind of thing that makes sense of all these other things that we know are true. And so, the first thing that one of the guys on the panel asked me is like, well, but generally speaking, he's like, I liked your paper and that kind of thing, but like, why is it that you're positing these other types of causal models or this other ontological, like metaphysical entity, we'll call it the mind, when you should always go to the simplest explanation, like
and
we all know.
That's the thing you're very questioning. Yeah,
that's exactly it. And I was like, well, but I'm questioning. And he's like, well, so I pushed back, and then he's like, well, but like, why you never argued for why it is that this extra information therefore means that we should change the model? And I was like, isn't that what science does all the time? We develop models of the material world, and then we run experiments. And Jordan Peterson brings us up in this very talk. We run models. We develop a model, we run experiments, and then whenever we find a piece of information, like something that doesn't conform to experiment, that doesn't meet our model, we know our model is wrong in some way. And so if you buy my statement that you have intention in asking me this question, then your model needs to explain it, or you can't, or you need to update your model. And so, like, what I feel like is going on here is that Douglas Murray has constrained everything down to the material efficient causal model, right? And so then he can't make sense of all these other things, and now he's got this dissonance, right? Because now he's like, well, but like, how did God do this? And like, how does God work in the world? And like, where's this God molecule that's like waking Jesus's heart up in the grave and that kind of stuff? And you're like, no. This is the wrong question. It's very much the wrong question. Like, you should be questioning your fundamental precepts about, these things. And he can't do that. And I think that, like, that's why I think that our modern view of causation is very, very much flawed, which I agree with Jordan Peterson and Pageau's point, but I don't think they have a very good way of describing it, because I think that the way they describe it is kind of like it's just a noble fiction.
Yeah. And I think this was one of the things that that Vervaeke and I have bounced back and forth on each other a lot about this. I think that science, like early science, kind of undermined teleology, and then also to some extent undermined formal cause, right? And that there was sort of this vacuum, and that I think that what people don't realize happened is that evolutionary biology is basically letting teleology back into the scientific ontology without letting people know that that's what they're doing. Right, because like every time you make a evolutionary biology argument, you're basically making a teleological argument. And like when Brent and Heather Weinstein will argue, for their evolutionary view of society, and like, oh, actually, marriage is, monogamy is helpful because it prevents there being a surplus of males, and it helps both parents invest in their offspring and paternity certainty, and, reasons of why marriage is good. But, we're not claiming theology. We're just doing science. But no, they're doing the difference between what they're doing and what Aquinas does with natural law theology is nothing. No, there is no difference because it's teleological argumentation.
You're right. Yes. No, that's exactly right. I think that, they're. Yeah. And C.S. Lewis makes this point. This is not a new argument, right? Yeah. He makes this point like, okay, if you're going to say something is better for this reason or that reason or whatever, you have to have some ideal that you're working toward. And so, like, if we're saying that the universe, actually, the ideal works toward, like we're working toward this thing and it's better, you have to, like, I don't know how you get around the idea of God then. And this is where, like, I do agree with Jordan Peterson. It was like, okay, so then the very fabric of the universe has been ingrained with what God is trying to do and work toward. okay, like
Yeah.
I don't know how that's incompatible with the traditional Christian view at all. And in fact, I think it's very much what we would expect, right? Is that like Jesus is bringing about the kingdom of God? Okay, great. Like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Like you're speaking my language now, right? Like I don't know, like why they think that this is like incompatible with it. Like the fact that you can describe this thing with a formula in no way undermines my belief in teleology or formal cause or divine causation or anything else like that. And in fact, like guys like Kepler, and this is another thing that Vervaeke gets wrong in the history of the philosophy of science, by the way, is that like guys like Kepler, they saw exactly the opposite. It was precisely because of their belief in divine order that they thought that they could describe these things mathematically, and they weren't just like randomly moving or anything else like that. And so like the idea that, okay, if their belief led them to come up with these equations, and the beauty of them like is what convinced them that it must be true because these are elegant, beautiful equations, and so therefore they must reflect the transcendence of God and that kind of stuff. It is very baffling to me how later we can be like, well, that kind of undermined the beauty and the Christian system or the legitimacy. I was like, no, we expected that, actually. That was precisely what was predicted. And now you're using...
There. Speaking of Kepler, there is a little bit like, Aristotle thought that the planets revolved in spheres, right? Because spheres would be perfect because circles are perfect. And so how fitting for the planets to have a spherical, axis of rotation. And then Kepler's like, well, actually these ellipses fit the equation. The data fits a lot better if we can do an ellipse, and an ellipse is a slightly more complicated equation than a circle, right? We got two parameters instead of one parameter. And okay, now we can then connect it to Newton's laws of physics, and then there's actually an underlying simplicity and beauty to why we have ellipses and not spheres.
Right, and then we don't have to like wonder about why we have to introduce these little kind of minor little blips in the orbits anymore, and so they became more elegant, not necessarily more simple, but they became more elegant with fewer and so so I'm reminded of what's interesting in this talk is that they go over a lot of, talk about beauty and those kind of things, which is really interesting to me because there's an article in I think it's 1967 Scientific American. It's by Paul Dirac. I don't know if you know who that is. He was a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He came up with the Dirac wave equation. Not really important, but he won the Nobel Prize the same year that Schrodinger did, and in physics. So he's one of the big wigs. He's less known than obviously Einstein or Schrodinger, but he was a really, really famous physicist.
But he didn't have any analogy involving cats, so
right, yeah, exactly. But so basically he was talking about Schrodinger's wave equation and one of his wave equations. And and he was recounting what Schrodinger was talking to him about. And so Schrodinger came up with this equation. And so he's like, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful equation. So elegant and that kind of thing. And so then he went and then they tried to run it in a lab. And it didn't conform to experiment. And so Schrodinger gave up on it for a while. And, but then he just kept coming back to it because it was just so beautiful. And then eventually Schrodinger, decided to publish it anyway. And he found out that if he just approximated something a little bit more, then it still kind of conformed to experiment. So he published it. But he was just so taken by this equation that there has to be something here, right? And so anyway, so he published it. Well, they found out later that that's the reason it wasn't conforming to experiment was simply because no one knew that the electron had to spin to it. And so once you incorporated the spin of the electron, it did conform to experiment, and the equation didn't need to be approximated at all. It was actually accurate. And so Dirac is saying, well, what are we to say about this. Like, sometimes adherence to beauty is more important than even experimental results.
Right.
And what are we saying about that? God is a mathematician of a very high order. That's how he like basically concludes this Scientific American article in 1967. And so like this idea that like because we can describe things mathematically or something like that, we've removed teleology from the universe is a complete non sequitur. And so that's where like Douglas's like worries of, well, we know how this happens, by which he means you just know the material and the efficient cause. You don't know like the teleological cause of any of the stuff. Like, so you're fretting about something that honestly, I don't think that you should be fretting about at all. Like, if anything, like this to me points toward the divine, not away from it.
Right. And I think Douglas mentioned earlier in the first clip that we played, sort of like that religion seemed like the god of the gaps and that science slowly got better and better at closing the gaps. But that's basically just if you say that there's only material and efficient cause. All right, so God is one of the efficient causes and one of the material causes. Oh, wait, science gets better and better and better at explaining all the efficient and material causes, and the room for God just gets squeezed out and squeezed out and squeezed out by increasing model accuracy, right?
Right.
But if you leave room for the higher levels of causes, then there's no competition. And I don't think that's exactly what Douglas meant by non-overlapping magisteria, right? He's using kind of like old language for that, right? Like, you know, we've got science over here and then maybe morality and theology over here, but they don't touch each other. I don't think that that's what I'm trying to say at all, and I don't think Aquinas or Aristotle would like that either. But that it's there because the causes do overlap, right? And everything has aspects of all the causes simultaneously. And so that really, it's not that there is a God of the gaps that's getting slowly pushed out by increasing efficient causal, knowledge or something like that, but that there are these whole layers that are left out of the scientific picture that actually the scientific picture is maybe nested within or something like that. And I think that's sort of what Peterson and Pageau are trying to do, is knit together a larger metaphysics to help Douglas realize that he's trapped in some smaller sphere and can't see the bigger spheres or something like that.
Right. I just think that they need to use different categories, maybe, or different nomenclature, maybe, that's not nearly as loaded, because they keep using terms like fiction or myth or story or whatever. And I feel like that's too loaded for Douglas to understand what they're saying. Because I think that I agree with Jonathan largely on a lot of his points. My issue is that, by talking about this in terms of like, oh, it's a fiction, and we're all in a fiction and that kind of stuff, like you're in some ways you're buying into like the modern like fact myth truth, like you're kind of buying into that entire like way of framing it. I just don't think that's helpful for someone like Douglas. And that was my like, it was a fascinating discussion. But I was like, listen, guys, you're not doing yourself any favors. You've got a lot of really good points, but you need to like move on. I thought that maybe we can skip to like Jonathan's Big Bang link.
Sure,
because
I've got that. Like, I'll pull that up in a second. Just keep talking for a little bit.
Yeah, so, I think that if, Jonathan, he's hitting on something really, really good in this next clip, but it really, it doesn't, Douglas is able to kind of worm his way out of it because Jonathan wasn't as forceful in making the point and didn't use like I don't think he used like the right language, but like he threw it out there and it was a good point. And I think I know exactly where he's going with it. But I think that, he, again, like he just wants to like keep it a little bit squishy for my taste.
Yeah. All right, let's listen to this clip.
You're attempting to resurrect those values. I see that as the same pattern.
But I think, Douglas, I understand your question. Like, I understand your question. The answer is the grave empty? Something like that. Like, was the grave empty? And this is, I think, where maybe it's the most difficult for many materialists to understand. And I know that my ramblings about the glass and about the good and about this might seem like it's going all over the place. But it's actually supremely important to understand that if you change your perception about the manner in which the world exists, focused based on the idea of a good, of an ethic, that it's what underlies even the factuality of the world, then that which will convince me of the truth of the resurrection is not about a bunch of material facts. It's about the imposition of that story as being so real that it overwhelms everything else. And it shines a light on everything else. Through the image of the resurrection, we're able to see everything through it. So if you ask me, like, what is the mechanical cause of the resurrection? Like, how is it that this body could, I would say that is obfuscated not only in the text, but also in the creed. The reason why in the creed it says he rose again according to the scriptures is because nobody wanted to try to give you a mechanical description. And in the text itself, when the disciples encounter Christ, they don't even recognize him. What is going on there? They don't even know who he is.
Well, in the beginning at Emmaus, yes.
Yeah. So there's a desire in the text to obfuscate the mechanical causes of the resurrection. That is not the way. So if you try to get at it that way, you're never going to get there, obviously. But I don't get there that way because I see through the world through the resurrection. And it makes so much more sense. And that's maybe C.S. Lewis's argument, is to say, like, give me that one. We need one miracle. Everybody needs one miracle to then lay the world out from that miracle, whether it's the Big Bang, there's whatever it is, you need that first miracle. Give me the resurrection and I'll explain the entirety of human experience through that one miracle. So that is what convinces me of the resurrection. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
So I was thinking about this idea too. I'm sure Jonathan will have some criticisms of this idea, but we'll see. So there's this idea in Christianity that the voluntary sacrifice of Christ redeemed the world. And so then you might ask, well, and that's already happened in some fundamental sense. But the stories that put that proposition forward play with the idea of time in an extreme way, because you have the notion, for example, of God being the Alpha and the Omega and being outside of time. And so the manner in which time is being used in the stories is very mysterious. But then I would say, well, it seems to me that it's something like this, is that a sufficiently courageous confrontation with the catastrophe of life would redeem it to an indeterminate degree. And that's already happened because we have the example. But even though it's already happened, we still have to do it. It's something like that. And you know, there's this emphasis in the biblical writings in particular that each person has a divine part to play. And that in some sense, the part that each person plays is equally necessary and equally valuable. And so we have the pattern, which is to confront things in as forthright a manner as we possibly can and to bear the maximal degree of responsibility. And that will redeem things, but we still have a real destiny. Like, we each have something real to do that that's been granted to us, or that hasn't been taken away from us or lifted away from us. And we could turn the world into hell if we wanted to, but we could maybe do the alternative in some real sense.
I don't disagree with that. What Jonathan says about the resurrection and reality, of course, raises a particular conundrum, which is that if you're going to use religion as an explanation of reality, you're also describing the event that subverts reality completely. That the resurrection is the thing that is the least possible thing to do given the world as we understand it.
Least possible than the Big Bang, for example. I don't know. I see all scientists move towards something which is least possible.
As a
yeah, of course. That's something that is impossible as a precondition for possibility.
What I'm trying to get to is a sort of, not diminish it, but having your cake and eating it, which is religion explaining reality, reality explained by religion, and also this thing happens that has never been able to happen, and that if you can make that leap, then you've got the faith in religion. I'm not saying that this isn't possible to do. You obviously do it yourself. But it's two things that seem to be in some very, very deep way contradictory.
Yeah. So I think, like, I think I see what, I'm curious to see what your thought is, but like, I think I see where Jonathan was trying to go with that. And it was a good point.
Yeah. Yeah. But I also feel like Douglas had a point in his response, and they were kind of making slightly two different points at the same time. And they didn't quite meet each other, although they got kind of close. But I mean, that they're, you think that you've escaped this problem of there's a miracle somewhere with your worldview, but you haven't, right? I think that was basically Jonathan's point. And Douglas was saying, like, look, you either have to say that the resurrection is so in defiance of the natural order, it's how we know that it was a miracle and what helps us believe beyond the natural order, or you have to say that everything makes sense because of the resurrection, and in which case then it's perfectly to be expected. You can't say, I think that was Douglas's point, which was, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think that's right. But like, I mean, the thing is that, that's what always kills me about, like, well, if this happened, it's the only time in history that this has ever happened. And you're like, yeah, I can name at least one thing that pretty much everyone agrees only happened once, like in the universe, and that's the Big Bang. And so if we're going to say that this is the one thing that, like, we can't make sense of given our understanding of the natural order as it stands right now, like, it'd be the Big Bang, because we were even saying, like, hey, time didn't exist, space, like all of our normal rules of even physics that we know, the things that we're most sure about, do not apply before this point, right? And so you're like, okay, so if we can all make that leap, that there's this one thing that that you can just totally you can be like, yeah, it happened, and I have good evidence for it to happen, and I can believe that it happened, and it only happened once, and it's never been observed, and all this kind of stuff. Like, if you can make that leap, then there's no, like, evidential, like, there's no epistemological reason why you can't make another leap around any other miracle. Mm-hmm. And then the second point is, well, Douglas, like, okay, if you wanted something to stand out, wouldn't it be something that doesn't normally happen, right? If God was trying to make some kind of point like this, like, say, creation, he would do something that only happens once. And if he wanted to do something that, that would stand out in other ways, say, like, forgiving our sins and that kind of stuff, it would be something that only happens once and doesn't happen normally. So, like, this is all, like, perfectly in line with even other things that we believe happen. Like, and so I don't understand why this would be, I don't think that this is a good objection. I guess I think that, like, I think Jonathan did a really good. I think he had a really good point in that way of saying, like, you already do this, so, like, that doesn't subvert your reality, right?
Yeah.
You're not going around worrying about a Big Bang every other second or anything else like that, and it doesn't, like, completely fundamentally, like, change your view of space or time or gravity or anything else like that. So, like, why would this subvert your understanding of the universe? I don't think it should.
Right. And Douglas didn't have an immediate comeback. But
no,
I
like,
think
you could tell that he was, like, taken aback by it. It was a really great moment, and I just wish that Jonathan would have, like, pushed in a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because I was like, yeah, no, you've got a really good point. Like, this is a thing that happened exactly once. We have good evidence that it happened. We have no explanation for it. We have no, like, mechanical, like, explanation or description or anything else like that. Like, and that's one of the things. Like I always laugh at people when they're like, oh, but we know how the universe, is, blah blah blah. And I'm like, okay, but if I were to, like, let's go back, 1,000 years. And I had two people. I had, and you guys didn't know. No one knew how old the universe was, or anything else like that. And so I've got one guy that says, no God, no creation, not a thing. Like this is just what is, right? That like the universe is what is, and that kind of thing. And I was like, okay. And I've got this other guy, this like Christian or Jewish guy, who says that God like spoke the universe into existence and created and formed everything and that kind of stuff. And then I presented evidence that actually like all of the universe started at one particular point in time, and like from there, we got everything. And before that, like as far as we know, there's nothing to speak of, or at least like we can't speak of what it was. I was like, which story does that sound more like? Does it sound more like a creation story, or does it sound more like an eternal universe story? And I was like, I think that like we would all anticipate that person saying, yeah, like this guy's explanation for that makes way more sense than this other guy's explanation for that. And yet we all accept it. And the cognitive dissonance doesn't seem to ever hit people. And that's what like irritates me. I was like, like this is a problem. Like you would not have predicted this. You would not have predicted that we would have this evidence. And yet it happened, and it only happened only once. So I was like, I don't know why you're expecting me to be like bashful about the resurrection, because like, hey, if that can happen once, then a lot of things can happen once.
Right. And that, William Lane Craig tries to get a lot of mileage out of that with the Kalam cosmological argument. Right. That's kind of the main thrust of the Kalam cosmological argument is like, Big Bang implies thing bigger than Big Bang.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, some physicists, I think, try and get around that. Like Roger Penrose is sort of like, yeah, actually, maybe eternal recurrence is really...
Right. Yeah. No, you have to go for something like that. But then now you're actually postulating things based on, like, things that can't be scientifically even experimented on. And so you're like, okay, at some point, we're not doing science anymore. And so, like, then, therefore, like, of the things that can be scientifically verified, like we're both postulating different kinds of things. And so like you can go with like, I mean, even Aquinas and Aristotle and, Origin and that kind of stuff, they all thought that the universe could actually be eternal, like philosophically speaking. So they didn't think that that was like a logical necessony. Like Aquinas thought that it was a revealed truth.
And in fact, if anything, their Platonism, wanted an eternal universe, right? That made more sense under Neoplatonism, right? But they had to chaff against Neoplatonism to be like actually ex nihilo creation,
and that's why, like, but Aquinas' cosmological arguments still work in that case because it's a vertical one, not a horizontal, like the Kalam. So it's not like sequential causes. It's more like no, there has to be a first cause for all the causal chain above it. Yeah. Even in any individual point in time. And so like it's a very different kind of claim. But like the point is that if you're going to swallow the Big Bang, I don't know why you can't swallow the resurrection unless you thought that the evidence wasn't sufficient. Or was compromised or something like that. I understand someone who thinks that like, oh, if they were under the impression that say the Gospels were written in 400 AD or something like that, and like there's no reliable eyewitness testimony. You're like, okay, yeah, like I can see why you would reject it, but like you already accept one singular event that you have absolutely no explanation for, upon which you base a great deal of your understanding of the universe. I don't see why the resurrection isn't in that category, and I think I think the Pageau,
and then that changes the nature of the debate a lot, right? If it like Douglas is in like, you're asking me to believe an unbelievable thing. I'm sorry, I can't believe your unbelievable thing. And like, if you point to him, like, look, you already, the reason why you think it's an unbelievable thing could apply to something you already believe. So now we need to talk about, how do we know when unbelievable things happen or don't happen?
Exactly.
And that's a different conversation.
That's completely right. And I think that actually was someone like with Douglas, whenever he wants to go there, that you're asking me to believe something that's unbelievable, that like, we, based on our understanding, doesn't happen. You're like, well, based on your understanding, like, let's talk about that, because you already believe things that don't happen all the time. And so why is this one in particular beyond the pale for you? And it can't be, well, it's just never happened before, because we know there are a lot of things that have never happened before that you believe in. So like, it does change. Yeah, to your point, it changes the nature of the debate, and that's what I think needs to happen with Douglas, is just to like point out that you already believe these things, right? So like, why is this particular thing so unbelievable? And let's have that debate again. To go back to like kind of the our starting point, I don't know that would actually move the needle for Douglas, right? Because there's all these other things in his life that would probably, conflict, with that. And there's probably a lot of other motivations and things and that kind of thing. But like, I think that that's the best way of approaching that conversation with someone who is struggling with the same things that Douglas is struggling with, is like, well, we know dead people don't come back to life. And you're like, well,
that's sort of part of the point. Yeah.
That's part of the point, A. And then B, we know that things happen. You already believe things that happen just once. And you don't know why, and you still believe them based on the evidence. So like, let's go from there and talk about it. But yeah, I mean, it's just like a fascinating. I was happy that Jonathan had that line, and Douglas's like facial reaction afterwards was kind of priceless, where he was just like kind of.
Let me try and reiterate the point that I was previously making. Actually,
yes, exactly. Let me I'm just going to skirt past that because I don't want to touch it. Let me go back to it. But I wish that Jonathan had like dug in there. To say like, okay, because his point is well taken, I think, that we are all going back to things we can't explain. There at some point there's like rock bottom, and yet we know it's true, and that's perfectly justifiable. It's not irrational to do that, and I think that like Christians should be encouraged and not bashful about it, and saying like, yeah, like I'm not going to give you like and to Jonathan's point, I'm not going to give you a mechanical description of the resurrection, like or like the bodily like functions that went on or anything else like that. That's not what this is, right? And that it would kind of be like self-defeating if we did, because if we did give you that material, then there would be people
then you would explain it away. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Then all of a sudden they'd be like, well, this is actually what happened. And so we took away the resurrection, like by even like having that conversation. So going back to the point, by wanting to reduce everything down to the material and the efficient cause, even if we did give a material and efficient cause of the resurrection. So like, say, if you say, hey, you give me an explanation of the resurrection. Tell me how it actually worked and that kind of stuff. And I gave you an atom by atom description of what actually happened.
Actually, some weird aspect of magnetic energy that we didn't really understand until just recently, and we can tell.
And it's only happened once. You would then all of a sudden,
and Jesus was in the exact right place, and
yeah. And so then all of a sudden, you would be like, "Oh, well, then it wasn't really a resurrection. This is a natural event that's just very, very rare, right? That's what these people would do." And so that's the issue here, is that by having a very anemic view of causation, we kind of preclude out of the gate any kind of explanation. Because if I can't give you one, you say, well, it didn't really happen then. And then if I can give you one, you say, well, then there's not this other thing going on. So Jordan Peterson makes this point that, like, kind of by the religious playing on the terms of the scientist, materialist, naturalist kind of thing, then it's kind of like the game is like up front rigged against the
because that's what science was designed to do. It was designed to win that game. Right. But when science gets blind is when it remembers that it's only a sub game in the whole, show, as opposed to being the whole show itself.
Right. Exactly. That's why, like, science used to be called just like natural philosophy, right? And so like it understood itself as a subset of philosophy. And it was subject, therefore, to epistemological concerns and all these kind of things, metaphysical concerns. But like once we separated it out, it's kind of like it was allowed to kind of go its own way and then impose its terms on the rest of like our way of understanding the world. And the result has just been really bad philosophy ever since.
Right. And then like what I said earlier, that ironically evolutionary biology seems to have opened up a back door into science's own world of something that it had forgotten about, but it deludes itself that that's actually what's going on by saying that evolutionary biology is of the same kind as all of these other sciences, when it really, really is not.
It really isn't, because like it can't help but talk about teleology, right? There's no other way to talk about biology in that way, especially evolutionary biology. And so, like, now you start to ask questions like, well, okay, just why? And you're like, well, once you start asking those questions, it's a very different question than a chemist in the lab of like, what is going to happen whenever I run this experiment, right? Now you're having to come up with explanations, which I think is why, like, a lot of like progressives really dislike evolutionary biology.
Yeah,
because it is like it's asking a bunch of why questions, and we can criticize some of the explanations as like just so stories, and fair enough, like that will happen, right?
Yeah, our misfiring of teleologic imputation of cause, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we can criticize it all day long, but like the fact is that it is doing a very different kind of exercise as the rest of the hard sciences as we understand them. And so it's not astronomy, it's not physics, it's something very different. It's something much more, it's something much closer to like a natural philosopher or like a natural theologian, like trying to understand what it is that nature is aiming at. And then we have to ask, like, well, what do we think about that? What do we think about the fact that nature seems to be aiming for some of these things? What do we think about the fact that nature seems to be aiming for lifelong monogamy with humans, right? At least with the human species, like lifelong monogamy. What do we like? That's actually like the fittest way of being. Like, what do we think about these kind of things, right?
What do we think about the fact that religious societies seem to outperform non-religious ones? And even among religious societies, some religions seem better at the game of competing and surviving and propagating than other religions. Oh, okay. And then that's my point to David Sloan Wilson, that I didn't quite push him. Maybe I made it, maybe I didn't make it. But that's the answer, is like, okay, so you're saying that group level selection is this really important thing, and that humans cooperate together as groups, and religion is something like the cooperating system, right? That allows people to both act individually and as a group and balance those, concerns, right? And knit it around something that's larger than any individual person. Oh, okay, so that's the purpose of religion. I explained it away. Wait a minute. Well, why do we live in such a universe where that is the case?
Yes, right. Like,
and
if
what
that's
does
the
that
case,
say about something? And that is what Pageau is trying to say, where I see everything by the resurrection. Why do we live in a universe where the religion that is focused around the crucifixion of an innocent person is the one that seems to have the most oomph and civilizational pizzazz to it that Douglas would admit to? What does that say about the universe itself? And is not the success of Christianity a revelation about the nature of the universe that we live in? And that is sort of how you flip the tables on the whole material causation thing.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Like, why is it that a religion that's centered around like the most embarrassing thing that could have happened to someone, like the most awful thing? Like, how is it that we live in a world where the thing that is the most shameful, the most weak, the most like despicable act? How is it that the cross got turned into a symbol of victory? How is it that Constantine said like he saw the cross and is in this sign conquer. How? Like that's crazy because that's not a sign of strength. That was a sign of weakness. The Romans did that on purpose to embarrass people. Like that's how it was seen. And yet now we're here and it's like the most dominant religion on the planet. And how?
Right.
And
our civilization even now seems to be suffering because of its lack of allegiance to it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So anyway, like, no, I completely agree. Like it's something that like, I think that, we should probably have a follow-up conversation on like the other parts, because I think that is where they're trying to go. I just think that they do need to be, and Jonathan says it in the conversation. He does think that these events happen, right? The resurrection like happened, but he's not going to give a material like or a mechanistic explanation of it. And like, fair enough. I just think we need to dig in and like make it clear. No, we are literally saying this did happen, right? And we have good reason to think it happened. Given everything else that we know, I mean, it reminds me a lot of of the story, and we should probably end here because I gotta walk back home. But it reminds me a lot of the story that of in Surprised by Joy that C.S. Lewis recounted, in his talks with J.R. Tolkien, because Lewis was kind of a militant atheist, and kind of an evangelistic, like new atheist type, and that kind of stuff. A lot of similar to what Douglas was referring to himself as being, and is in talks with J.R. Tolkien, but like that changed his mind, and the reason is one of the conversations that made the most impact to C.S. Lewis was when Tolkien said, "Listen, you're obsessed with all these myths and these stories and the beauty of them and the resonance with them, and it means something to you and you love it." He's like, the one difference with Christianity is like, and why you should love it even more is because it was myth become fact. It was the one myth that actually happened, right? And all these other myths reflect this, and it's built into, and so in that way, like we would say, it's built into the fabric of the universe. There's reason that we write this story over and over again. There's a reason why we see these patterns go over and over again. It's because it's built into the fabric of the universe. And here's the time that it actually happened, right? And so that's, that was Tolkien's point to Lewis, and it made a huge impact on Lewis. And I think that's what I think that's like with someone like Douglas, what we would need to do is say, listen, we're with you. This is a narrative. We're with you. This is a story, and it's good for civilization, and it's necessary, and all the beauty and everything else that you're pulling in whenever we talk about the cathedrals, which they do like later in the talk, and the poetry and the literature and everything else. When you're pulling, like you're seeing the goodness and the beauty in it. The beauty of, but the great thing about this is that it's also true. Like it is actually the story. Like it is the beautiful, good story that actually happened that all these other things are reflecting, and that's why it means so much to you. And so, like again, like that's another thing that I think is an underrated argument is that if there's something that really, really resonates, and it resonates across time with all people and across civilizations, and like we're moving toward like a more condensed version of that story, and we're getting closer to it. I was like, there's something actually there, not just metaphorically there or anything else like that. Like this isn't something that we should just dismiss. Like maybe if the Christians are right, maybe we're wired to seek out that truth. Like maybe we're wired, being made in the image of God, to seek out and identify and see that for what it is. And that's why we do it. It's not an accident. It's not a spandrel or anything else like that. It's like, what David Sloan Wilson would probably say with religion or whatever else. Maybe he wouldn't say it's a spandrel. Maybe he would say that it's actually like evolutionary.
He would agree with Bart Weinstein. It's a useful self-delusion.
Yeah, it's a useful, but like, Dawkins would probably say at best a spandrel, and maybe like a parasite, right? Something that we can like, get rid of. or whatever. But some people say it's a spandrel. It's just like a byproduct of other evolutionary processes and that kind of stuff. I would question that. I don't think that that makes a lot of sense. I think that like Brett Weinstein's definition of, or test to see whether or not something is an evolutionary advantage is a good one, right? So is it time tested, right? Is it complex?
Costly.
And is it costly?
Yeah.
Right.
And
those
widespread.
are the three.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, does it span across generations? Right. Is it
span
costly?
across space? Yeah.
Yeah. Is it costly? So it's not like a simple, like random thing that just could keep happening over and over again and whatever. Mm-hmm. And then is it costly? And I think that you can say, well, our religious impulses meet all of those things, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so like at that point, then it's an evolutionary advantage. And that fits in very, very well with the natural law kind of view of the world. Like very well. It'll be like, yeah, we would expect then those who, and the Bible scriptures like reiterate this, we would expect that, right? We would expect those who were more likely to adhere to this, like, or the civilizations that are more likely to adhere to these principles. If they are like, if this world was built for this, right? If there's a telos to this world, we would expect it. And so, but for some reason, like, I think a lot of folks, especially if they came of age in like the 90s and the 2000s and that kind of stuff, they kind of assume that that's not the case. That like this is like, if I can explain this away via some like material or efficient cause, then therefore it undermines its truthfulness because I've explained it away. And I think that we should just like really question that. I don't think that that's true at all. And I think by introducing like the Aristotelian causal categories, we can say, no, they're all happening simultaneously, right? I'm choosing, me, formal Tripp, is choosing telos to pick up a drink, material, and efficiently drinking it, right? That's all of these things are happening simultaneously. And so we don't need to separate them out and be like, well, because I can describe all the atoms in Tripp's arms and the neurons firing and that kind of stuff, then therefore we get rid of Tripp's intention in doing it. And so that's another thing, like maybe like we'll have a follow-up conversation, but like Jordan Peterson at one point gives like an entire like teleological causal chain in talking about why are you writing this paper for me?
Yeah.
And so then he like keeps going, right?
And at the end is the universe is good, basically.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So you're like, so you just keep doing this teleological chain. And I was like, notice at no point is there a material efficient cause in there. Yeah. And yet we all accept that as a causal explanation in why that student is writing that paper. Because they want to get a degree, they want to get a good class, they want to get a degree, they want to get a job, they want to do all these kind of things. And you're like, okay, well that is a causal chain. There's no, and we all the time we use that as a causal chain. And yet for some reason, whenever we're talking about things like the resurrection, we want to completely get rid of that kind of causal chain. And we only want to talk about, well, we know dead people don't come back to life. You're like, that you're completely you're being very inconsistent with your causal descriptions of things. So anyway, I thought, like, again, I would encourage people to listen to this talk, and I would like to have follow-up conversations with you because we didn't get to like even like a fraction of all of this, but like that, this was like, everyone should listen to it, and then we should probably do a follow-up conversation because there's so much here that's like thoroughly fascinating that people should listen to. And I've probably done too much talking. I'm sorry for being a bad conversation partner.
No, that's fine. Made my job easier. All right. I'll end it here. Thanks everybody for listening.